York Wildway, which I'm here to talk about, or I'm virtually there to talk about, is a landscape scale conservation plan that the Western New York Land Conservancy is working on to ensure the ecological viability of across Western New York and to protect the biodiversity of our region. And the goal of the Wildway is to create a network of habitat core areas and linkages between those cores throughout the 8 counties of Western New York. We only touch a little bit of Niagara County though. And to connect Western New York outside of our region with the areas south of here in Pennsylvania and then over to the Finger Lakes and the Adirondacks and beyond. And so why are we doing this? You know, the Land Conservancy has done a great job over the years of working really hard to conserve beautiful locations, important habitat. But throughout our history, we've really kind of focused on conserving lands as they become available. And we're at a place now where we're really seeing a number of issues arising in our region. So we have the prospect and the current reality of the climate changing. We have the impacts of poor land use decision making or kind of scattered land use decision making, where we have these larger forested areas and these larger connected habitat areas being fragmented, and where we're seeing the decrease of our interior forest species, whether they're wildlife or plants. And we're seeing the proliferation of these edge species or these more generalist species, which are more like the raccoons and the deer and the squirrels, the species we're all really used to seeing. We're seeing more and more in those and fewer of these interior species that require interior habitat. We're also seeing, this is an example of some poorly sited development. We've got barriers to wildlife movement in the form of development, in the form of roadways, all kinds of different things that make it really a lot harder for wildlife to move across the landscape. And then we have the proliferation of invasive species. So this photo is from Land Conservancy Preserve, and this is now in the midst of being removed, but this is entirely buckthorn, which is one of the main invasive species in our region. And as you get more and more edge habitat, you have a decrease in that core habitat area, you get more and more invasive species issues, which decreases the amount of native species you have. And all of these things are kind of combining in a global extinction crisis for wildlife and plant species. So in America, 1/3 of our species are vulnerable, with 1 in 5 at a high risk of extinction, according to the National Wildlife Federation. So all of those lead us into what can we do? How can we help these issues? And how can we ensure that Western New York is a viable place for plants, animals, and people into the future? So some solutions could be reducing carbon emissions. We could work on protecting large forested landscapes. We could ensure wildlife can move through the landscape. So this is an example, I think out in Alberta, of what they call a wildlife overpass over a highway to reduce the collisions of wildlife and cars, but also to increase the permeability for wildlife to move across the landscape. And we can restore degraded landscapes. And the Western New York Wildway is this little section here of this map. So this map is called the Eastern Wildway. This is put out by the Wildlands Network, which is an organization working to preserve and restore key ecosystems to allow wildlife to move across their historic habitat range. And they have put out a number of these maps. There's one of the Pacific region, of the West Coast, and this is the Eastern Wildway. And so it's an ecological vision of how we can ensure that in the face of climate change and all of our changing landscapes, that wildlife and plants are able to move to appropriate habitat as the climate warms, and that they're able to continue to exist in our area. So when this map came out back in 2019, I was very excited to see. I had previously been working my career over in the Northern Forest region, where there's lots of habitat and lots of connections being worked on. And then I moved back to my home. I'm originally from Williamsville, And when this map came out, I was so excited to see that we were part of the Eastern Wildway, that Western New York was as important as I thought it was in the ecological viability of the East Coast of the US. So the purpose of the Wildway and why I'm here to talk with you about it is exactly that. We know the climate is changing, and we know that plants and animals need to shift their home ranges. And we know that they need wildlife corridors and large habitat blocks to be able to shift those ranges. We also know that climate resilient lands are those places where the most high quality habitat will continue to support a diverse array of plants and animals. And so the Western New York Wildway is a landscape scale approach to looking at how can we conserve and possibly expand the core habitat that exists in Western New York. How can we really look at the connectivity of these core areas to ensure that they don't become islands? And how do we allow that flow of species to their appropriate habitat? So some of the key concepts for the whole Wildway concept I did not come up with these, much smarter people than I did. So there's kind of three big components we'll be talking about. Core areas or core habitat are these large natural habitat areas that are the building blocks of basically the entire system. So these are the places where there's enough natural habitat. In our region, it's typically forested habitat for wildlife and plants to live and have that interior space of habitat. They're usually large blocks of contiguous forest, and we have them scattered throughout our region. We also look at linkages or corridors. So these are those places between core areas where wildlife and plants move throughout the landscape, and they're able to get from one core place to another. So you can kind of think of it as, you know, you've got a neighborhood here and a neighborhood here, and you kind of need a way to get between the two. And the same kind of function works for wildlife and plants as well. How do they get to the new neighborhood they need to get to live? And then we have compatible use areas. These are areas outside of linkages, outside of cores, where the highest, most intense human use occurs, and where we are trying to encourage wildlife-friendly practices. So that could include, you know, planting native plants in your town or village, or ensuring that riparian areas have buffers along them, because lots of wildlife and plants move along those areas. So those are the concepts that we'll be talking about. And this, I don't know if you can see my mouse. I know the people in person probably can't, but this over here is kind of an example of core habitats, riparian areas. It kind of explains how, you know, a typical area of Western New York and those areas within it function in the idea of a wildway and through wildlife passages. So I'm going to pause before I jump into the next section and just see if anyone had any questions about everything I just said. Hearing none, I'm going to charge forward. So we initially came up with a draft map. This incorporated a bunch of the best data sets that existed at the time. So we were focused in on the 8-county region of Western New York. We looked at Eastern Wildway cores and Eastern Wildway corridors. So those are, if we went back a few slides, that's a data set available from the Wildlands Network. They took a very wide-ranging view of the East Coast and identified areas they thought would function best as cores and they thought would function best as corridors. Then we also took matrix forest blocks and linkage zones. So these are two data sets from New York State DEC and Natural Heritage, and I think TNC, the Nature Conservancy, that identified these really large blocks of forests in our region that were very important to our region, where those were linked to other large forested blocks. And we took the furthest extent out of all of those things in Western New York, and we said, okay, this is our draft map. We're going to take this to some partners, and a number of them are on this call. So this is like the second or third time they've heard me talk about the Wildway, maybe even more for Jean. And we decided, you know, let's get some feedback from all of our partners and see what they think. So we did that. We presented a draft map to a number of partners, including environmental nonprofits, some state agencies, and local indigenous nations. And the primary feedback we received on this were, three pieces of feedback. One was how important everyone thought it was that the Wildway actually touched both parts of the Great Lakes in our region, so Lake Erie and Lake Ontario. We are the only part of the Eastern Wildway where we're touching both Great Lakes, and that connection can be made. So that was a primary importance to almost everyone who looked at the initial draft map. We also heard from a bunch of our partners in Chautauqua County who were like, hey, why is Chautauqua County left out? Chautauqua County is amazing. We have lots of state forests. We have lots of important habitat. What's going on there? And then the third part was, an encouragement from all of the different partners to consider what was important to them. So whether that was waterways or climate resilience or pollinators or what have you, that, trying to make this a large umbrella concept as opposed to just taking into account one or two things. So we took all of that feedback, we kind of marinated on it, and we decided we really wanted to do our own GIS analysis. So previously we were taking other data sets and creating a map, and we decided we're going to put that to the side and we're going to use the best available data and do our own mapping analysis to figure out where the existing cores and potential cores are and what the best linkages between those are. So GIS stands for Geographic Information Systems, and it is a mapping software that allows you to, geographically map things and compute things to do analyses across an area to find whatever you're looking for if you have the right data set. So we use this analysis to look at to figure out Wildway core areas and figure out Wildway corridor and linkage areas. So to figure out the Wildway core areas, we knew we wanted to have them be at least 4,000 acres in size. And that is because of analysis based on female mammal home ranges in our region. And then we also wanted to look at, when we looked at Wildway corridors or linkages, we wanted to make sure that they were at least 300 feet wide. And we're still inspecting whether that's big enough or not. We've got a secondary analysis going on. So when we use GIS to identify our Wildway core areas, we basically evaluated 5 factors that indicated core habitat. So we looked at large areas of intact habitat. We looked at large protected areas. We looked at areas that had high resiliency, which means they were highly likely, as the climate changes, to host the most diverse array of plants and animals. And that's a data set from the Nature Conservancy. We also looked at resilient and connected landscapes. So that's taking into account that climate resiliency, but also adding a layer of connection to make sure that you're incorporating what is next to the habitat you're analyzing, not just that piece of habitat in itself. And then we also looked at matrix forest blocks, which were those large areas of forest in our region. And we scored, everything got a score of 1. So every area got a score based on the presence of one of these 5 things. And the higher the score, the higher the total core score was. So this is the results of that analysis. 5 would be the most important, highest core score of 5 is shown in blue. And then you had other high core scores of 4 in this darker green color. And you can start to see the areas where there is core habitat in our region, down in near Allegheny State Park, there's quite a bit of core area. We've got Zoar Valley. If you go all the way up, we've got Iroquois. You've got some areas over in Cat County, and then you start to see, oh, there are some important areas in Chautauqua County. It probably shouldn't be left out of the analysis. So we took all of those results and we went through, and when I say we, I should say that we worked with a wonderful contractor to help us on this, because I am good at making maps and not great at the analysis. So We then built out those core areas to include natural land tracts directly adjacent to areas that scored as 4 or 5s. We included waterway polygons and protected areas that were adjacent. And then we made sure to, what you can see on this slide is in black, the major roads in our region. So we made sure to take a look at those as we were doing the analysis so that we didn't ignore, like falsely ignore the major roadways and say, you know, everything around Allegheny State Park is one big core area, because in actuality, there are a lot of roads and hindrances to wildlife movement there. So they all kind of became their own separate core areas. And at the end of this analysis, we came up with 38 core areas with an average core size of 17,500 acres. Some were significantly less than that, but all the core areas we identified were 4,000 or above. Then we again used geographic information systems to determine the linkages between Wildway core areas. So in this case, we looked at 3 data sets. We looked at intact habitat that lends itself to species movement and has the shortest paths between other tracks, because that's really important for wildlife. All wildlife is functioning on a calorie deficit, and so the shortest paths that are easiest are always best. So we also looked at easiest paths or least cost paths between intact habitat, and then the ever important riparian buffers that we all know wildlife and plants use very frequently. And then we took all of those data sets and we said, where can these areas provide connections between core areas? And this is a map showing those linkages. So in the darker blue are the very best linkages, the best paths in between the core areas. And in the lighter blue are linkages that could exist or do exist, but they aren't as prioritized and didn't score as highly as the other best paths. And then we wanted, when we were looking at all of this, we wanted to see, okay, where are the most important core areas and where are the best linkage paths? And when we're looking at this, one of the things that's really important to keep in mind is that everything should be considered dynamic and used primarily as a planning tool, as opposed to like, this is all true. So there's tons of things happening in all of these core areas. Some of them are state forests, some of them are state park, and then some of them are private lands and a mix of all in between. So these are just areas that mapped as and analyzed as being the best for to function as core, but aren't necessarily, you know, all protected. And that cores and linkages may be fragmented by many different things. We then wanted to kind of come up with more of a general boundary so that we had the ability, you know, everything that falls within this planning area of the Western New York Wildway is important to a degree in the functioning of the Western New York Wildway. So we really wanted to have an opportunity to, you know, kind of identify what falls within the Wildway in Western New York, and also give ourselves the opportunity and our partners the opportunity to work with towns, villages, and other landowners that fall outside of these prioritized areas, but still fall within the Wildway and could do really amazing work in their own right to ensure that their practices or, you know, decisions might incorporate some wildlife and native plant friendly practices. So this is a very splotchy, complicated map, but basically what you're seeing is an exterior boundary of the planning area of the Western New York Wildway. Dark green are core areas, areas that map as core. Dark blue are the best linkages. And then we have potential core expansion areas and other linkage areas. And those are areas that could maybe function as core or could maybe function as a good linkage, but at the moment maybe aren't functioning in that way. And then since I'm talking to Erie County, I thought I would zoom into Erie County and we could take a quick look at where the Wildway kind of moves through Erie County. And it really is moving through the southern and eastern section of the county with a couple of different core areas, some linkages, and then some, you know, ideally compatible areas throughout the Erie County region. And I think that's it. So yeah, next steps for us right now are working with partners. We've got a couple of different partners identified to work with throughout the Wildway. We also want to work to create Wildway partnerships based on location, so that organizations or towns that are interested or landowners that are interested can talk with people in the area they're working in, and try to have some synergy towards some of these goals. We want to continue our prioritization work. So at the Land Conservancy, we're running through a prioritization analysis to pick out what areas within Western New York are most important to conserve, and that we should be working on, and what are other places maybe that lend themselves towards restoration or towards compatible use, etc. We also are working on a website and additional resources for both towns and individual landowners that can help them in maybe, native plant guides, etc., that can help in some of that on the ground decision making. And then outreach to municipalities and stakeholders like all of you to get more feedback and see who's interested in working on this concept, or if there are suggestions on ways to make it better. So with that, I'm going to say thank you for listening to me ramble about the Wildway, and I am happy to answer any questions anyone might have.